Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Life, the podcast where we help you level up so you become the best software engineer on your team, or we help you level up so you land your first engineering job. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
Okay, and today Jared has decided on the topic. So Jared, please tell us what are we going to discuss?
Today, we're going to be talking about the big do's and the big do nots of CSS. A lot of students that I've had, and I'm sure along with you, Juan, have struggled with CSS. CSS isn't always the most intuitive thing when you're beginning to learn it. And even engineers who have been, developing for a long time, a lot of them haven't spent the time to understand CSS to leverage it correctly. Oftentimes, CSS is treated as a second-class citizen in web development. So we're going to dive into just a few different, again, do's and don'ts with CSS.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Awesome. Yeah, so let's just start by defining like the CSS thing, right? Like what is CSS? Let's just start there.
So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and they are used for styling your web page, right? Your HTML creates the structure of the page and the functionality of the page to a certain extent, and then CSS comes in and does all sorts of styling, from colors to fonts to margins, padding, widths and heights, all that good stuff.
Okay, no, that's good. So now you're talking about two things. One thing that I would like to cover, which is like you're talking about this concept of cascading, right? So let's elaborate on that. Cascading just means, for anybody listening out there, it's just that you have think about of it as a hierarchy. Right, the first thing that loads, right, it will be like it will have lower priority versus the thing that loads last. So once you load one of your style files, for example, or you put styles there and they're loaded last, they're gonna overwrite or they're gonna enhance the previous rules that you had in your styles. The browser has defaults, so there's defaults styles for the browser. So usually you will overwrite those too, and that's why it's like cascading. So you can have theming, for example, you can have base styles, and then you cascade. You have another style that you load on a specific page, and that will override those rules or enhance them. And there's a lot of things that we're going to branch out and talk about today, but something that I like to mention about before we jump into the best practices and do's and don'ts is that to understand the CSS is structured, right? So CSS is a rule-based language, right? It has syntax where we have rules, and these rules are key and values, key and value pairs. The keys, right? They are a property, like for example, you say width, height, right? And the value, a value that is matching the type of that rule. So for example, it could be in pixels, or it could be just, for example, a hex color or an actual color name, right? And one last thing that I like to mention about these before we jump in is that we have the selector, right? That's a keyword, right? Selector. So selector is just the element of the rule, like you are defining a rule through a selector, and that helps you pick what element you want to style or what group of elements. And one more thing, there's something called add rules, right? So add rules is just these add statements, right? That you see in CSS, like for example, add import, add font, add media. That was the media queries, right? So those are add rules or add rule statements, and those are like the foundational things you need to know. Please go and research everything you can about them. So then all these do's and don'ts will make more sense as we dive in. And yeah, so let's start, Jared. What's the first do and don't?
Yeah, so the first do not, the first don't would be to, Juan mentioned CSS selectors. Well, there's a variety of different CSS selectors out there. Just to name off a few, there's class selectors, ID selectors, element selectors, pseudo selectors, lots of different selectors to choose from. However, there's only really one type of selector you really want to use. And the reason for this is that to get to the don't, we don't want to use a CSS selector of too high of specificity.
Specificity,
so, yeah.
What? Okay, that's an interesting word, and that comes up a lot in interviews, right? Especially for junior openings, people ask, what is specificity? So Jared, what's the specificity now that you mentioned it?
So specificity is essentially an order of precedence of if you have one selector that has a certain level of specificity and another selector, a different type of selector that has a different level of specificity, the higher level one is going to take precedence and overwrite it. So an example of this is an ID selector. It has a higher specificity than like an element selector. So if you have both of those in line, and even if you have the ID or have the ID one before the element one, the ID one is always going to override that. Now, the actual selector you will generally use, so if you want to talk about the do in this case, is you always want to use basically CSS class selectors for all of your elements.
Okay, yeah, that makes that makes sense. Yeah, so because of the different specificities, right, to keep things consistent and uniform as your application scales and grows, right? You don't want to have this chaos because of classes and other selectors fighting each other, right? Or maybe you have issues and you have to start using important and other things, right, that we're going to talk about. So yeah, the specificity very important. And yes, using just classes. And just to clarify, the class selector is just that selector that starts with a dot. And the ID selector is a selector that starts with the pound sign. So you don't want to use the pound sign IDs. So really IDs, right? You never want to use them for CSS. You want to use them for JavaScript. When you have JavaScript or you have labels and forms, right? And the class selectors use the ones with the dot. You want to style everything. You want to define all your selectors just with classes. That's a good done, right? Like do use class selectors, don't use ID selectors or other type of select. I mean, don't use ID selectors. That would be the one.
So Juan, what are some other ways that people might style their application with selectors of too high of specificity? What are some of the other items that we want to avoid?
Pro tip, when we listen for our audience, right? Google something I use that I like using, Google a specificity calculator. So in that one, you will find many of them. Just open one and type, for example, type a class with some rule like class and then the name of the class and then the width and some width. And then create another class and, for example, use an ID. And then that calculator is going to explain how the specificity is calculated. There's 3 bytes, like 3 numbers there. Like, and it's 1 or 0, right? 1 0 0 is higher, right? So it shows you how to calculate. There's a whole thing. Like, I mean, I don't have it all memorized or everything. You don't have to memorize it, but it's good to know, like when you have, for example, an attribute, right? It's a higher specificity, right? Versus a class. So things that we commonly use in CSS is attribute styles. Those we do want to use because usually they help you group elements. So CSS is about grouping and styling. So you can group, for example, instead of having to put the class in 3 places, you can use an attribute, right? Or you can use a class that contains another class. But that leads me to the don't, which is usually you do not want to style native elements for 2 reasons. One, what you mentioned, Jared, the specificity is too high traditionally, and then overriding that becomes more cumbersome because you have to start combining, like, okay, let's add an attribute and a class to increase the specificity, or let's include the element with an attribute, with a class, with a, so it's just like becoming very messy, and that's reflected in the code. So really, like, you don't want to style native elements when possible. Ideally, you can just always put a class, but yeah, you want to minimize or try to avoid that. Always, like, don't be lazy, define a class, because that usually goes down. I tease my teams, but I usually tell them, like, hey, this is lazy, that you are not defining a class. You define it and but I have to put it in all the links. Okay, good. Do it, right? Unless it's like, because usually, like, for example, if you're using Bootstrap or something else, like, they're usually going to target those native elements for you. You don't want to conflict with that. You want to be explicit, and you got to be declarative, right? So declarative, you open the markup. There's no magic. You see that the link has a class. You can search in your ID that class, and you find the rules that are applying on that selector that you created. So that's why declarative is better. You don't want magic. That's why we avoid styling native elements.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. One bit to add to when you are naming your CSS classes, like Juan is saying, be very declarative. So, you could give a class perhaps a very generic name, but why not be just a little bit more specific to make it really clear that that element is what's being selected? There are instances, if you're working in legacy software, where if you use a generic enough, CSS class name, it very well could get overwritten by some global CSS that's taking place either lower down or has a higher specificity due to the way the CSS is arranged. And yeah, because CSS is like this behemoth that kind of grows, if you will. So it's really important to be building on, good practices, good clear code when it comes to CSS.
Yeah, and CSS, I mean, just to remark the importance, like, why are we talking about CSS, right? If you don't have CSS, your page is not, your application is not going to look good, right? Most likely. So you got to use CSS. And if you don't use CSS directly, you're probably importing a library that is using CSS. So CSS is one of the core things that just as important as knowing HTML and JavaScript in 2020. You want to be the best engineer on your team, you got to really dominate and know your CSS, because that's going to, especially if you're doing a lot of front end, right? Or full stack, you got to know your CSS. So that's why it's important. So Jared, next do or don't, like what
Yeah.
So
share? the next, I'm going to start with the do in this case is you, and just kind of leading into from our previous topic, we do want to have a solid understanding of CSS, and that needs to take place both through research of reading online, but it also needs to take place in practice. So again, if you're using just VS Code or StackBlitz or whatever, a code pen, play around with CSS, when you're, try building out different elements, try replicating how to build certain components like modals or what have you in these little applications, so that you can begin to really gain understanding of how the CSS is working, how different selectors work, how different specificity works. And I say this because, one term that Juan has used before is building on a lie. And the same thing happens here in CSS. If you're, maybe you get something to work in CSS where you've got your elements to be positioned right or whatever, but let's say you need to change something. Well, what happens when you change something and you have bad CSS? Well, everything's going to like start moving around and be, messed up. Whereas if you had a greater understanding and greater practice of CSS, you're going to know exactly what to do to change it, the CSS or the HTML structure, to get what you're looking for. So that would be the do not is don't build on a lie, and the do is to understand it.
That's really good. That's really good. And that leads me to the next one, which is it's related to that, like the understanding, right? So there's two things that are related. One thing that like the do, I would say in 2020, you want to normalize how you write your CSS. And by normalization, I mean, for example, you want to define a style guide for your CSS or for your Sass, because most likely you're using Sass or a stylus, some sort of preprocessor for CSS. So you have like a richer syntax, but you want to normalize it because if you have other people working on it, a bigger team, right? You want to make sure that everything is consistent. So practices to normalize that, learn, for example, I always like that everybody learns about, I always ask to my teams that, or my students, like learn about object-oriented CSS, OOCSS, right? And this is this methodology about creating these composable, reusable classes where you can, instead of defining one class, let's say button, and you define the button and the color is blue, right? You define one class called button and then another one called blue, and then you combine them. Now it's composable and it's scalable, and that in 2020 became so popular with it's been this been around for several years, but like Tailwind CSS, right? It's based on utility classes, right? And utility classes is really grabbing of course more granular object-oriented CSS, but it's really that concept of composable classes. So that means like you reduce the amount of CSS classes you have to write, like one for a red button, one for a blue button. No, you just write blue, red, button, and then you compose them, you combine them in the markup when you consume them. So the style guide, right? Object-oriented CSS, maybe learned a little bit about BEM, but this depends if you are using encapsulation for your CSS, and that part of the style guide, right? So if you define, right, you do normalize you do normalize how you write CSS. These elements will help you normalize better. One more thing on that is that minimize the global CSS you write. So don't start like adding just one CSS file and just writing everything in it, right? And then, so part of that normalization, you define how the CSS should be structured. Maybe every page has its own file, or each component, depending on what you're using. Here we're keeping it agnostic, but that's my do, right? My do is do normalize your CSS, right? Learning all these things I mentioned. Don't just write as you go. We have like, a set of rules that normalize how CSS should be written, because there's so many ways to do it. There's no like a right or wrong, right? So you want to normalize it, be consistent, be opinionated.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't agree more. Yeah, I highly recommend students go and, like Juan said, go look up Tailwind CSS, or mean, there's also a handful of other utility CSS classes out there as well, but understand them and realize what they're doing. I mean, they're really not doing anything particularly fancy. They just have a bunch, they basically just written a whole bunch of CSS classes that they put together that you could then just import and then start utilizing on your elements.
And it's so popular like that. Those like utility classes now. They're called utility classes. That's the fancy name, right? But that's just how you're current to CSS more granular, right? So Jared, I'm just gonna go ahead and share our Twitters. Let me just go ahead and share here. And so anybody listening out there, you can follow me at Twitter, at twitter.com /Juan Lizarazo G. That's spelled JUANLIZARAZOG. Whatever platform you're listening this on, we're putting links to our Twitter, so you don't have to type my crazy last name, right? And yeah, just follow us, get in touch, ask us questions, DMs, right? And we'll help you out. We'll try to provide resources. This week I provided some resources for one student that wrote out, so that's really cool because you can help and make an impact. And yeah, follow Jared too.
Yeah, you guys can find me at twitter.com /Jared Potter. That's spelled JARED POTTER. And yeah, always feel free to reach out, say hello, tell me what you're working on. And if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it both for you and for the rest of my Twitter audience.
Yeah. So, yeah, and whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on, subscribe, follow, right? Give us a review, give us a star. I mean, whatever that helps increase our reach, so then more people can benefit from these. We're trying to close the gap, right, between graduation and landing your first job, right? So perfect. So Jared, what's the next do or don't?
Yeah. So the next do and don't is to don't use CSS floats. So CSS floats have been around for a long time, and it used to be the primary way that you would essentially tell content to go to the right side of the screen or go to the left side of the screen. Now, just to be clear, in CSS, there's lots of different ways to do the same thing. But this was kind of the common way if you needed to shift a bunch of content to the left or the right. However, something came out called flexbox. And as soon as flexbox came out, it got rid of the need to use floats. So if you haven't already played around with flexbox or gotten really familiar with it, I highly suggest that you do become familiar with it. It gives you a lot of control with just a couple of selectors. There are like lots of CSS selectors for flexbox, but I probably only use a core, probably 6 or 8 of them in day-to-day use. So highly recommend going and using flexbox instead of floats. What's your take on that, Juan? I'm actually curious.
Yeah, so flexbox, I remember that came out like over 10 years ago, but of course when something comes out, it takes 4 to 5 years to vendors, right? To, for example, Safari, Chrome, right? To actually implement it, right? I mean, many browsers are evergreen browsers. They're really good at it and they just implement things fast, right? But as things are normalized, so I remember when it came out and I couldn't really use it, right? Then it was like 2015 and I was like, okay, I want to use it, but still I can't, right? So because there's, I had to use like these polyfills and things and still use the display blocks. So from my box model, I had to use blocks, right? And floats, right? But then now that Flexbox is 2020, right? 2020, you should be using just Flexbox, right? It's supported by even I11, like some basic things that like most likely for positioning that you will use. So it's very powerful. But yeah, there's Google. So this is a pro tip here. This is what helped me learn Flexbox. There's this Google game, this Flexbox frog game. And there's a little frog that teaches you Flexbox. You have to do Flexbox stuff to move the I don't remember if it's to get the frog across or to do something with a frog. It's like a game. So I did that so many years ago, but you Google that and that helps you learn Flexbox, and then you got to master it. You got to master it in 2020. You will be able to position things the way you need to match the specification provided by your UX designer or whatever you want to match or build for your, for your customers. So Flexbox are definitely the way to go in 2020.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you got, like what Juan was saying, if you Google like CSS Flexbox games, there's a whole bunch of different challenges and games that make learning CSS Flexbox really fun. So definitely take a look.
My favorite part of CSS Flexbox, and this was a pain back in 2000, like 10 years ago, was vertical centering. Anybody doing CSS knows that centering something vertically is such a pain and so hard, right? It's really hard, sometimes impossible to accomplish without JavaScript or without invisible divs and hacks and percentages. It's not perfect. Flexbox solves that really easy. And also, yeah, it's really, really fun to work with it.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add, and this is kind of going back a little bit to understanding CSS, is that when you put HTML elements on the page, they're either going to be a block element or an inline element. And understanding what the difference between those two are and being able to practice with them is going to be crucial. So when you do start using flexbox, you know, like basically how they're going to react to that situation. So making sure you understand that side of the HTML is going to be very helpful.
Perfect. Perfect. No, that's really good, Jared. So the next one I want to mention is really do use a preprocessor, right? In 2020, you should not be writing pure CSS. The reason is because pure CSS has some fallbacks, right? And a preprocessor can help you, for example, next classes, and it will figure out for your CSS how those classes should be established. So instead, like having the hierarchy, for example, instead of having like some class space, another class space, some other selector, right? It will figure out for you. It will let you do more reusable things. So it's about reusability, readability, right? Maintainability. So it makes things maintainable. So in 2020, you should be using a preprocessor. And the reason why that is so important is because it will help you, besides all that things, all those benefits and more benefits that I didn't even mention, is that it will help you with vendor prefixes. So in 2020, you should be using vendor prefixes because the different vendors approach the CSS differently, but you don't want to write 5 lines for the 5 different vendors, like, okay, WebKit and all these other ones and Mozilla, right? Because it's a lot of repetitive code and you don't really know that. So you can use something like post CSS connected to your preprocessor, to your bundling, right? Or you can use something like Parcel that provides that out of the box, right? But really it goes down to use a preprocessor. Use SAS, use less, use stylus. Those are the most popular in 2020. Use one of those, stick with it. Don't write pure CSS. So don't write pure CSS. Do use a preprocessor.
Yeah, and if you're using something like, you know, one of the common frameworks out there, they're going to have that more or less built in or make it really easy to add that in to your project. So it just is part of your compilation process.
Yeah, you can, like with Angular, you select if you want to use one of those or just pure CSS, right? Vue, I mean, I know that it has also built-in preprocessors configured for you. With React, I mean, React is more a library, but it's so powerful that you can configure it, right? And if you use, for example, create React app, you can configure it to also have the CSS, the SAS capability, right? Just having the configuration for your Webpack bundler, and it comes like all out of the box. So yeah, definitely that's a good one, Jared. Yeah, in 2020 using frameworks, it comes all configured.
Definitely. The next kind of do that I think many students should be aware of is to make sure that you're building your site to be a responsive site, mobile friendly site. So what that means is using either and or media queries and or CSS grid to be able to manage what does your site look like on a particular device. In 2020, a significant number of web page browsing happens on a phone. It doesn't happen on a laptop computer or a desktop computer. Your web apps that you're building, generally speaking, are going to be consumed on a device. So it's not for everyone. Depends on what type of software you're building. Some software is pretty much only designed for a desktop computer, but if it's more general use or general audience, then you're going to want to make sure that it is mobile friendly. So the don't here is don't just ignore it and not care about it, and do actually consider it. So
yeah, and to make it just like the default, use default to mobile first development, right? So mobile first design. You start building just for the mobile first, right? And you will like the responsive group using the @ rule media, right? And you write that, and then you just start going to bigger screens, and then you're like, okay, you build it, got it to work. Now let's go to bigger screens. But if it is responsive, naturally it's just gonna work. Then you adjust it so it looks better, right? But mobile first is really powerful in 2020 for web-based apps or progressive web apps that rely on CSS. So that's a really good one. Jared, one very simple one that we cannot not mention, right? Which is don't use inline styles. 2020, this has been like the rule for like many years, 15 years or something, but don't use inline styles. This just means that you have your element, your markup, your HTML. Pretty much your HTML shouldn't have any CSS there in the element, right? Like the style attribute. It could have the style tag or the link ref tag. That's fine, right? In your header, in your head, right? But don't do it in line, like having a button style color, because the specificity is too high. It's really hard to override, and then you'll have to use important, right? And let's say I have seen this code like multiple times, and also with students and things, is that having an inline style with important, that's the highest specificity you can have, and it just makes it really hard to override. You don't want that, right? So the only reason, the only and they do, right? Do use classes, right? Do separate your presentation from your document structure. So markup, HTML, separate from your presentation, CSS, styling, theming, right? And the only time where you can use inline styles is when it's dynamic and you are maybe computing some sort of element for some reason. For example, you have to define a height at runtime based on a user setting, and there's no CSS pre-generated for that. That would be just the only acceptable time an inline style, and it's not really a native inline style. Most likely it's going to be a framework thing that you would use that would compute into an inline style. But that's the only time, and it's not really CSS at that point that you're writing directly.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and you said it there, but the key word there, if you're in an interview and they're asking, hey, why would you not do this? You know, part of the answer would be the specificity is too high. And then the other one is, that Juan talked about separating it out, right? So the key term they're going to want to know there is separation of concerns, right? You're separating the style concerns from the HTML concerns.
From the document structure. And I mentioned the important, right? Do not use important. Like in 2020, do not use important. Like never use the exclamation important in your CSS, because that just turns it into the higher specificity you can have, right? It's just too high and you don't want to do that. And then when you have important over important, right? Cascading, it just makes it too complicated. Don't use important. If you feel like you have to, you're maybe writing on top of a lie, or you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing, one more do here that I have is to, and this is related to kind of the mobile responsiveness, is to use a relative unit. So an example of a non-relative unit is going to be pixels. So we don't want to really use pixels anymore. Pixels don't mean as much as they used to mean in computers with such a diverse set of screen sizes as well as pixel densities on screens. Pixels aren't a good way to go these days. So instead, you'll want to use a relative unit instead. So the two main units out there that I see are rem, or relative element size, is a unit, and then the EM, the element size, right? Correct me if I'm wrong on those, Juan.
Yeah, so the purpose of using relative units, it goes down to doing this thing called responsive typography. That's one of the main objectives. And that just means, like, have you ever opened a website in your phone and then the text is so little, but then you open on the website and it's big? So responsive typography takes care of that, and usually it uses relative units. And this applies also to elements, width, height, everything, because the fonts have a higher density of pixels per inch, right? PPI, that the pixel just translates 10 pixels is the same in the font, but the font has such a high resolution that it looks so little. So we want to be using EMs and REMs. So REMs is use REM, and Google everything you can. Here, like in this podcast, you have homework. You have to Google everything we mentioned. We just like expose you and throw you things for you to learn more and level up, right? But the REMs, root EMs, right? So it depends on the root, which is the body and the HTML styling, right? So relative to the font size to those. And the EM is relative to the parent, right? So usually you will see modern frameworks, modern CSS libraries, using EMs and REMs or just REMs, right? REMs are usually easier because you don't depend in the parent. So if the parent defines something, the child doesn't change. So REMs are really powerful, very easy to use, but there's cases where you really need to use EMs. So you will see them. Usually EMs, you want to EMs, you want to minimize them. But no, that's a really good one. And Jared, I want to mention this one, which is like in 2020, like for CSS, you want to be you want to apply, like you want to normalize your box model. This is very important. When you start a project, normalize your box model. And this just means like this could be a combination of applying a reset. So reset your HTML, your CSS. You can get CSS normalized classes out there that you can just apply, or your friend will do it. But the reason for this is because this will help you also normalize the box model, which just means like you have an element, and let's say you apply a padding, right? The element is going to get bigger. Initially, it's going to be really hard to like, I don't want that size. Let's say this happens, like you have an element, you want a width or 100 pixels, right? Let's say 100 pixels, or, and then you do that width, but then you apply a padding of 5 pixels. Now the actual width is going to be 110 pixels. So if you normalize the box model, Google this, normalize CSS box model, and you can find utility classes for that or some CSS reset, right? But you want to do that before you start the project so you have the best experience when you're implementing things. And, but yeah, Jerry, do you have one more before we wrap this up?
No, I think that's pretty succinct there.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, let's wrap this up. Let's do the recap since we're out of time now. So the do's and don'ts we covered, right? So yeah, Jared.
So yeah, we said to don't use selectors of too high of specificity. Instead, you should use CSS class selectors. With those class selectors, make sure that you're being consistent with the naming of those classes. We also want to make sure that we have a good understanding of CSS and with practicing it and researching it so that we're not building on lies as we are building our CSS. And then when something changes, it completely messes it up. We want to use relative elements rather than pixels. We want to be able to use flexbox, CSS grid, media queries instead of using floats or other statically set items. What else? We do not want to use inline styles. We do not want to use important. Again, we're just going to use CSS classes.
You want to write composable classes, so learn object-oriented CSS. You want to use utility classes. You want to use a preprocessor, right? You want to use vendor prefixes, right? So the processor will help you with that. You want to most likely use some normalization style, like a CSS reset, Google CSS reset. You want to normalize your box model, and you do not want to use IDs. And I think, yeah, and you want to, of course, go find play games to learn Flexbox. Go and find the specificity calculator, right? Go and learn about those CSS rules I mentioned, the cascading. You want to learn that, and yeah, but I think that covers everything, Jared. So yeah, today was really good and it was really fun. This is episode number 10. So now we're a real podcast here. It's awesome. So yeah, so thank you for joining us this week in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Life. This was Juan Lizarazo.
And this was Jared Potter.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
See you later.
Bye.